Hi everyone. So in our last video we introduced the free will defense as a response to the logical problem of evil. In this video we're going to start trying to evaluate and see if that defense can actually hold up upon reflection. In this video we'll talk about the ways in which it might run into trouble when we start thinking about God's omnipotence. So in this video we'll just briefly review what the free will defense is, and then we'll jump into some of these questions about free will and God's omnipotence. We'll talk about compatibilism about free will and how that relates to God's omnipotence and the free will defense. And then we'll talk about incompatibilism about free will and how that relates to the free will defense. And then this will raise the worry of whether or not that incompatibilist view would end up having to deny God's omnipotence. So remember, the following is the central idea behind this supposed logical problem of evil. It's impossible for both a perfect God and evil to coexist. Now, if this really is impossible, and we know that evil exists in our world, then belief in a perfect God is irrational, not just false, but irrational given the existence of evil in our world. So in order to avoid the conclusion that a belief in God, or at least a perfect God, is irrational, one would need to show, and not just say, that it really is possible for a perfect God and evil to coexist. Showing it's possible that God and evil coexist doesn't require that you know why God actually allows evil, so you don't need to give a theodicy. However, you do need to give an example of a possible world where both a perfect God and at least some evil exists. So it's okay if you know that the possible world you describe, the story you tell, is not the actual world we live in. All that matters is that the story you tell is one where there is a God, there is some evil, and the story makes sense. There's no contradiction in your story. If you can do that, that would be sufficient for responding to the logical problem. Because all you're trying to do is provide a proof that there's no contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. So all you need to do is you need to attempt to give a defense. So notice, this is still more than just saying, look, maybe there's some greater reason God has for allowing evil. You need to show that there is actually a story where there could be a greater reason. And so you need to describe one possible greater reason God could have that would allow evil to enter the world. So the free will defense says that the following is a possible world. So I'm going to describe this in a bit more detail than I did in the last one. So free will is a very good thing. God is all-knowing and thereby knows that a world with free will is better than a world without free will. God is all good, and so God wants there to be a world with free will in it rather than one without free will. God is all-powerful, and so God would have the power to create a world with free will in it. Thus, a perfect God would create a world with free will. So that's the first part of the story, connecting up God's knowledge, God's goodness, and God's power to explain how God might create a world with free will. All right, but now here's the rest of the story to explain how evil might come about in that world. However, by creating a world with free will, God thereby gives his or her creatures the ability to choose between doing good and doing evil, and takes the risk that they will sometimes freely choose to do evil. Sometimes the free creatures that God has created freely choose to do evil in this story, even though God, being all good, doesn't want them to. Thus, these free creatures bring evil into the world, even though the world was created by a perfect God. God, however, recognizes that free will is such a good thing that this is still better than a world without free will. Now, the hope is that this story shows that it's at least possible for a perfect God and evil to exist in the same world. So if it's successful, that means there's no contradiction in believing that both God exists and that evil exists. And so the fact that we see evil in the world wouldn't thereby show that theism is irrational. A couple notes about this, though. First, the free will defense doesn't say we live in the world that was just described. It doesn't say that that story that was just told is a true story. It just says that the story makes sense. There's no contradiction in the story that was just told. And if that's right, then it would show that it's possible for God and evil to exist in the same world. Also note, that defense doesn't attempt to show that it's sort of rational to believe in God. It's just defending the belief in God from one reason given for thinking it's irrational. Now, maybe there's other reasons to think that theism is irrational. But the point here is the theist isn't trying to defend the claim that this belief is rational. They're just trying to defend this belief from the problem of evil itself. Another note, this story is oftentimes thought to be the point of the story of Adam and Eve. So the story of Adam and Eve is often read not literally, but as a metaphor for the free will defense. Now, if you read the story literally, it seems as if there's a whole bunch of problems with the story. I mean, one, it seems to conflict with our knowledge of sort of evolution. That seems to be bad. But secondly, like even ignoring sort of evolution, there seems to be a bunch of moral problems with the story of Adam and Eve. First of all, Adam and Eve are supposed to be like children who just don't have any knowledge of how the world works, and they don't have any knowledge of right and wrong. And so if they disobey God, if they do something wrong, is it morally okay to punish a child for doing something that they had no way of knowing was morally wrong? So that seems a bit tricky. But here's another sort of interesting point about this. Notice on the story of Adam and Eve and the story of the fall, it's not just Adam and Eve that are being punished for their actions. It is the entire human race. No other person is even given a chance to sort of make their own sort of choices regarding sort of disobeying God or not. It's Adam and Eve, they make a mistake, and now God is going to punish not just them, but every other person that has not done anything wrong yet. And this would seem to be morally problematic insofar as you are punishing one person for the sins of another person. That seems to be unfair and unjust. But nonetheless, usually when people read the story of Adam and Eve, they don't read it as, at least until more recent times, throughout most of history, is read as a metaphor. The idea that evil doesn't exist in the world because of God, but rather God gives us free will, and then it's up to us to either choose to do good or evil. And once we make the wrong choices, we bring evil into the world by our bad choices. All right, that sort of part of the story of Adam and Eve seems to latch on to something that seems rather sort of plausible and avoids all those maybe worries with the sort of moral lessons of reading it sort of literally. All right, but this also brings up the question, though, is the free will defense actually successful at meeting even the minimal goal of describing a coherent story where a perfect God and evil both exist? So if the story that the free will defense tells is not even coherent, then it doesn't even illustrate a possible situation where God and evil exist. So to get to the heart of this, let's consider a question. Consider, can God create creatures with free will who always freely choose to do the right thing? Now, there are some reasons to answer yes to this question. If God's omnipotent, God's all-powerful, mustn't that mean that God has the power to create this world? Moreover, the best proof of a possible situation is the fact that it's actually happened. Now, you can't make this maneuver here if you're talking to someone defending Islam or Judaism, but consider Christianity. Doesn't Christianity, at least, believe that God has actually done this, created free creatures that always do the right thing? Isn't that exactly what happened in the story of Jesus? Jesus is supposed to be yes, fully divine, but also fully human, and was given opportunity to give in to temptation or to sin, but always freely chose to resist that temptation. Now, if Jesus resisted that temptation because Jesus just didn't have any free will, then that would rob the salvation story in Christianity of all significance. And that's the central story of that religion. And so if someone is a Christian, it looks like they at least have some reason to answer this question yes. Similarly, here's another reason on behalf of a yes answer. Do creatures have free will in heaven? heaven is supposed to be a place where everything is sort of perfect. There is no evil. There is no badness in heaven. But if free will is such a good thing, wouldn't the creatures in heaven, so when people die and go to heaven, wouldn't they still have free will there? But if they do have free will there, but there is no evil in heaven, doesn't that just illustrate the conceptual possibility of there being free creatures that always choose to do the morally right thing? Right, so the problem can be boiled down to this. Perfect creatures would always freely choose to do the morally right thing and do no evil. Because perfect creatures would always care about other people. They would never be lazy. They would have a perfect character, and their character would lead them, when they're given an opportunity to do one thing or the other, to make the morally best choice. But imperfect creatures, ones that are maybe a little bit lazy or maybe a little bit selfish, they would, if you give them free will, they would sometimes freely choose to do the wrong thing and bring evil into the world. But the idea is a world where you create perfect free creatures that will always choose to do the right thing with no evil in it, that seems to be better than a world with imperfect free creatures that sometimes bring evil into it. So an all-good God would create a world with perfect free creatures rather than the imperfect free creatures. Thus, the idea is the free will defense's story about a perfect God creating a world with evil in it does not seem to be a coherent story. The proposal being made here is that free will is the kind of thing that's compatible with our actions being determined by the way God creates us. This is sometimes called compatibilism about free will. So the idea here is, well, when we think about free will, what does it mean to have free will? On this view, to have free will is just to say that the decisions or choices you make are a result of your own character, the kind of person you are. The beliefs you have, the desires you have, and the values you have is what causes you to make the choices you make. We'll investigate different views of free will when we sort of turn to that unit later, but this is the kind of idea being proposed here. Now, we can make our choices because of the kind of person we are, the beliefs we have, the desires we have, the values we have, even if God is responsible for creating us with that nature, as that kind of person. God could create us with a perfect nature and guarantee that we thereby choose the morally right actions. Our choice is still free on this view, since we make it on the basis of the kind of person we are, rather than because of any purely external force, like a person holding a gun to our head threatening us. When we act out of sort of duress, someone holding a gun to our head, we're not acting out of our own desires or our own sort of values in that sort of sense. But so on this view, it would make free will compatible with what's called theological determinism. The idea is our actions being determined by God. So consider this question again. Can God create creatures with free will who always choose to do the right thing? Now, it looks like the free will defense needs to answer no. Otherwise, it can't coherently describe a situation where God creates a world with evil in it. That's what we just saw. If you answer yes to this question, then it seems as if you're led to this view that, well, God, a perfect God, could have created a world where we have this really good thing, free will, and no evil, and certainly that would have been a better world to create than a world with imperfect creatures that sometimes do the wrong thing. All right, so it looks like in order to defend the idea that God creates free will and that thereby brings evil with it, you have to say that this is not really an option for God. And now there are some reasons that can support giving this no answer to this question. So many people believe that you only have free will if you could have done otherwise. So free will requires that there's multiple paths we can choose between. So as an example, this morning I chose to drink a mocha. Well, was that a free choice? Well, according to this view, it's only a free choice if I could have done something else instead. So my choice to drink a mocha was a free choice because it's still true that even though I drank the mocha, I could have chosen to drink a Diet Coke instead of the mocha this morning. The fact that it was up to me to decide between those two paths is why it was a free choice. Now, if God determines that you make the morally right choice, then it appears that there's only one path you can take. It looks like you could not have done otherwise. Thus, it seems as if you wouldn't have free will. And so, even if those choices are a result of your own beliefs, your own desires, the idea is it seems like you still don't have free will if those beliefs and desires and values are themselves determined by God. And so, the worry, however, is that it appears that God is not omnipotent when the free will defense is developed in this way. Because notice, aren't you saying that God does not have the power to create perfect free creatures that choose to always do the morally right thing? So aren't you saying that there's something God cannot do, and thereby saying God is not omnipotent? So notice the problem here is that either way you go, if you say, yes, God can do this, you get into problems. If you say God can't do this, you get into problems. We can turn these ideas into an argument that the free will defense will fail. Either God can create creatures with free will that are perfect and so guaranteed to always do the right thing, or God cannot do this. If God can create creatures with free will that are perfect and so guaranteed to always do the right thing, then God's allowing evil is not necessary to create a world with this really good thing, free will, and so the free will defense fails to show how God could have a greater good that would justify allowing evil. On the other hand, if you say God cannot create these kinds of creatures, then God is not omnipotent in the free will defense, and so yet again, it seems like we haven't described a situation where a perfect God allows evil, since on this picture, God is not omnipotent. So either way, the free will defense fails. All right. That's it for today. I'll see you next time where we're going to look at another problem for the free will defense that's actually going to help us maybe see a solution to not just this problem, but the other one. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.